having a job, what you and I would call having a job, they called wage slavery,
Hmm.
right? And one of the reasons that the Civil War even happened was that you had these people, you had like a brand new class of people, right?
Hmm.
Who weren't, they weren't farmers per se, right? So
Hmm.
therefore, society there wasn't really a place for them.
Hello, and welcome to Talk Ag to Me, the podcast dedicated to improving ag literacy around the globe. I'm your host, Brandon Black, and in today's episode, we're covering the urban-rural split. And for anyone who knows, this is going to be another part of our new mini-series kind of covering a few theories that I've had around this split and kind of what's causing it and what impact it's having on today's society. To help me with this episode, I have my guest today, Ben. If you'd like the chance to introduce yourself, you're more than welcome to.
Well, my name is Ben Kitchings, and I have been studying the urban-rural divide in America for oh Jesus, I don't know. Well, let's okay. I started out accidentally as a documentary filmmaker in the late '90s, um, and I was living in a mountain town in North Georgia, and it's right kind of at that point. It was right on the cusp of uh, sort of metro Atlanta. You know,
Hmm.
like I could come like 30 minutes south and be essentially in metro Atlanta, but it was still kind of
Hmm.
a small town. And these days it is squarely, I would say, metro Atlanta. It's the exurbs for sure. Um, but essentially, there was a process that started in like the 20s, I guess, the 1920s. Um, that later they called the Billy migration.
Hmm.
And what that was so you had, they call them hillbillies, right? Which
Hmm.
that's, to me, okay. My mother's people, they're from the mountains of North Georgia. My dad's people are from, uh, just north of Macon, Georgia, where I think Otis Redding is from. And so, you know, I'm basic, you know what I'm saying? I'm not trying to be derogatory. That's just what historians call it,
Hmm.
the Billy migration. And what it was you had these white people, and they would come off the farm and they would go into these factories in these cities. And this was all throughout Appalachia, which, as you might be aware, runs from uh, northern Alabama all the way to, I mean, the Appalachian Mountains don't check their passport at the Canadian border, but the Canadians that I talk to don't think that those are the Appalachian Mountains, but they are.
Gotcha.
Uh, so, you know, yeah, basically. And what happened was I have these books downstairs. I should say I have a master's in history, and I've studied the urban-rural divide for, at this point, Jesus, 20 something years. Um, you know,
Hmm.
um, but what happened? I have these books downstairs, and they'll tell you the Billy migration ended in about 1960 or 1950 or so. Uh, I didn't believe that then. I don't believe it now. I think it did end. I think it ended about 2000.
Hmm.
And I think that's our problem
Hmm.
politically. Is I think you get the city folk and the rural folk, and they just can't, even though like the white rural folk and the white urban folk are the same race, and they might even have the same last name and the same, essentially genetically the same background, the same whatever, but they just don't see eye to eye. And that's because urban problems and rural problems are dramatically different.
Mm-hmm.
And I've had a podcast for since March of last year and talking to people all over the country. The thing I've noticed is that the rural parts of this country are literally falling apart.
Mm-hmm.
And, you know, I heard a story from a guy in, I forget what state he was in, and I probably shouldn't say it if I remember, but I heard a story from a guy who told me off air. He said, "Yeah, I have to have an ATV just to go out, just to get into town." And he was talking about how the only places he could buy food in a store were like at a gas station, and that was for miles around.
Mm-hmm.
And that's on the East Coast. So, you know, I don't know. I mean, so what are your theories? I'm curious what some of your theories are.
So I've been approaching the urban rural split a bit from a specified lens, and what I mean by that is my podcast is mostly about agriculture, kind of explaining the connection between agriculture and the consumer, and kind of the rather lack thereof in terms of communication between the two parties. And so there's really not a whole lot of, I wouldn't say necessarily a political motivation in my podcast, but there's definitely that does play a role. Um, my podcast is more about kind of explaining to consumers why agriculture is important, and kind of explaining agricultural terms that in order for them to understand more accurately what's going on in the industry, and then vice versa, explaining to agriculture what consumers are curious about, what they want to learn more about, and what agriculture can do to better repair that relationship. So from the perspective of the urban rural split, I've been kind of studying it from that perspective of, you know, agriculture and the urbanized areas haven't exactly gotten along in some time, and I kind of have a timeline that I've proposed as my general theory as to when this started to occur and kind of where it's at now. Because we're starting to see there's almost like a cyclical nature to this thing where it started. This has happened before in history, but in American history, this started kind of from what I can tell in the early 20th century, and is starting to kind of loop back now, where consumers are becoming more interested in agriculture. They are starting to adapt more rural lifestyles again, even if they're still living in urban areas, because they see it as kind of a more peaceful, more kind of freeing lifestyle than as opposed to living in their urban dwellings.
I think you're right, and I think one of the reasons that urban folks see it as more peaceful is because, um, so my dad, his dad was a farmer,
Hmm.
and he had a job. I mean, he was an electrician for the railroad, but he helped out on his family farm quite significantly.
Hmm.
And I think a lot of people that see farming as peaceful, in a way it is, and in a way it's really hard, backbreaking work.
Hmm.
And there's a family story that when my great grandfather, so his dad, when my granddad's dad died, the doctor was a family friend, and he did an autopsy or something and found out that earlier on my great grandfather had a heart attack,
Hmm.
and the heart just built up other muscle around it, around the damaged part, because he was such a hard worker.
Hmm.
So like, nobody knew about that heart attack. you know
That sounds about right.
no so to Yeah, okay, it can be more peaceful, but it's a backbreaking sort of situation. um I think I would, if you want to be really super historical about it, I think you're right. I think about the turn of the 20th century was when this really kicked off.
Hmm.
And I think you see that in the way they talk about who's they, the way the the small town papers and stuff talk about jazz and things like that. I mean, believe it or not, jazz was thought of as, the devil's music or whatever,
Mm-hmm.
however you want to say it. Um, and I mean, that's, I guess, when you see it, but I mean, that you could possibly even go back to this before the Civil War. I mean, to a sense.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, honestly, if you want to think about it, if you want to objectify the country and just look at it from an objective lens, our country never really, as a political entity, never really reckoned with labor.
Mm-hmm.
Like, we never really reckoned with wage labor. Um, they used to actually call it wage slavery, which is interesting to think about. Like, having a job, what you and I would call having a job, they called wage slavery,
Mm-hmm.
right? And one of the reasons that the Civil War even happened was that you had these people, you had like a brand new class of people, right?
Mm-hmm.
Who weren't, they weren't farmers per se, right? So therefore, society didn't really, there wasn't really a place for them. But yet they did have what you and I would call a job, and it was a very skilled job. They were railroad workers, right? And all
Mm-hmm.
these railroad workers, there's a fascinating statistic that the northern railroad workers would almost universally vote for Abraham Lincoln.
Mm-hmm.
And the reason why do you think it was? Before I tell you why do you think it was?
I would, if I had to guess, I would say because Abraham Lincoln kind of stood for the labor force.
Well, it's a little more local than that. It's a little more down to folk than that.
Mm-hmm.
So you would, but you're right. So what they would be doing, now put yourself in their shoes, okay?
Mm-hmm.
You'd be building this railroad track, okay?
Mm-hmm.
And when you're building the railroad track, you're also building a town. Okay? You're building a town that you can live in while you're building this railroad track.
Mm-hmm.
Okay? Now, next to you, literally over the hill or whatever, like, you can actually see these people. These are people you can see.
Mm-hmm.
You would see these black people, and they were working just as hard as you were. They were doing everything you were doing. In a lot of ways, they were just as capable, and practically in every way, they were just as capable, right?
Mm-hmm.
In fact, if you take reading and writing out of the equation, they were just as capable as you were, and they weren't getting paid. Okay, they were slaves,
Right.
and the northern railroad workers literally looked at that, and they were like, "Oh, they're going to take our jobs," right?
Mm-hmm.
And so these people voted for Abraham Lincoln almost in mass. Um, you know, and then you see that in other ways too. So the mill towns in New England, okay,
Mm-hmm.
um, originally they were set up as almost temporary situations for young ladies to come in and work in a textile mill. And very quickly, these young ladies realized that if I have my own money, I get to make my own decisions and yada yada yada.
Mm-hmm.
And and so this is how, like, Lowell, Massachusetts sprang up.
Mm-hmm.
Um, you know, and so the rural situation in the country uh, didn't really have. They kind of looked at that on that with suspicion, and for really good reason. Okay, let's be honest here. I mean, we don't think about this because we live in it.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, we live in a world with money, where money is important to us.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, like you have to buy your food, you have to you have to pay the bank for your house or your landlord for your apartment or what have you, right?
Mm-hmm.
A lot
Right.
of people back then they didn't have to do that. There's a statistic that I don't actually remember right now, but it was a best boiled down into a story,
Mm-hmm.
and the story was that whenever Jesse James would ride into a town and rob the town, um, he would create kind of this economic seismic event because he would steal all the town's money.
Mm-hmm.
By robbing that one bank, he would steal all the money, and then he would create another seismic event because why? Because he would spend it in another town.
Mm-hmm.
You see what I'm saying?
Yeah, he's causing a flux in the economy.
Yeah, yeah.
Interesting. Okay. So I'm curious then, kind of fast forwarding a bit in in the timeline, because for my observations, kind of again taking the agricultural point of view on things, I've noticed that kind of post Civil War era, early Industrial Revolution era is kind of when the the boom of big cities first started to occur. And this was kind of the first time, kind of like you were mentioning with the railroad workers, the first time that people involved in manual labor started to realize that their jobs were losing value because there were better jobs they could do that they could get paid more for and have to do less strenuous labor. And so that started in at least in my view started to cause the first schism between agricultural or just general manual labor based industries and more urbanized careers.
Hmm. Yeah, I would say that.
Mhm. And so kind of the thing that I'm trying to pinpoint here is with this whole theory I've been running through is if we follow that timeline, kind of see as the split continued to occur, what ramifications did that have on urban life and on just in American society in general. What impacts did that have on the economy, on social life, on kind of general norms, on everything. Because I have this theory that agriculture is kind of foundational to society, and that separating the two tends to cause some kind of societal shift that's not. Not to say natural, that's not quite the right word, but it's not quite you know it's not quite the same as it would be for a society that was more agriculturally uh, dependent or involved.
Well, okay. I think if we fast forward to now, I think one of the problems that we have, one of the major problems in this country that we have, is that before the pandemic, okay,
Mm-hmm.
so before March 14th, 2020,
Mm-hmm.
you had, let me get the number right, it was 34 vacant structures, vacant housing units per homeless person in this country. All right. Now, let's talk about that.
Mm-hmm.
I talked to people. I wanted to know how business owners were making it through the pandemic or just people, you know.
Mm-hmm.
And so I would talk to people, and they would all talk about missing people, like people that they knew or that they saw in their day to day that were gone, that were just missing. And it's not like they thought they'd been abducted by aliens or, kidnapped by pedophiles or whatever, right? They were
Mm-hmm.
just missing, and there were a lot of them, right? It was literally every person I talked to except maybe two or three.
Mm-hmm.
And then I talked to a housing lawyer who explained that statistic I just told you. All right.
Mm-hmm.
So fast forward to right now where you hear about a worker shortage, right?
Mm-hmm.
Now, whether or not you think the worker shortage is real or not, I'm not here to argue with, but I think it's sort of real because you see like $18 an hour, at the McDonald's or the KFC or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
Well, here's the thing I've been chewing on for a while, right?
Mm-hmm.
What if, because when you're homeless, you don't have internet,
Right.
right? If you're homeless, you don't have internet. If you don't have internet, you can't apply for a job
Hmm.
in 2021,
Right.
right?
Hmm.
Okay, you see where I'm going?
Yes. No,
Um,
I definitely follow you. In which that kind of, that even ties back into another, argument's not quite the right word, but another kind of, a point, point of yours in terms of how the labor shortage relates to the, kind of lack of access to current resources. Um,
mm,
there's been a big conversation about the relationship between poverty and hunger and lack of labor and all that sort of thing, because those three kind of work in a vicious cycle. If you're poor, you can't afford food. If you can't afford food, then you're malnourished. If you're malnourished, you can't work, and if you can't work, then you're poor. And so,
and
it doesn't
right,
matter what point of that cycle you start. If you start in that cycle, then you're going to end up sticking to that cycle until either somebody pulls you out of it, or you find kind of a lucky break that gets you out of it yourself.
or yeah, I mean, and I think the other thing, that you need to talk about is you had said earlier that agriculture and society are separating. I don't think that's possible. I
Mm,
think the other problem we're having is that there's so few people, like the small farms are basically going,
mm,
you know what I'm saying? Um, and there's so much corporations that handle our food supply. I heard this fascinating statistic right when the pandemic was rocking about how much of our food actually spends time in China.
mm,
You know, like, you know what I'm saying? At some point in the food chain, some point in the cycle of that product, it spends time in China.
mm.
And that's an insane way to live to my way. I know we have to make some changes for that to go away. I know that. I'm not naive.
Mm,
But that's an insane thing to do is to ship food to China to package it and then ship it back to here.
right.
That's insane.
Yeah. No, I completely agree with you. We definitely have kind of a strange structure to our food supply system.
Right. And I mean, you know, and I think another problem you have is you have these people that, how do I want to say this right? It's like you're living in two different Americas,
Mm,
basically. There's two different, like you're dealing with two different priority sets,
mm,
and maybe to some extent you always were. But the difference now is you have social media.
right.
So, like, you can't change the subject. Like, you can't, like, social media has made us able to connect to folks. Like, I connected to you. I've connected to so many people because of this podcast, and it's wonderful and great
Mm,
that I've done that. But it's also made it to where, like, any little time my brain fires, I can throw that into a feed. And if I'm not
right.
thinking, you know, or it's just like that's a problem.
Right. Yeah. No, I definitely can. I can see where you're coming from with that. It's um, kind of to your point. I've definitely made a lot more connections through my podcast as well, and I've had my eyes open to just how big the world is just by talking to people who are from different parts of it. I speak all the time about how I grew up in a small, agricultural community where I kind of grew up being taught that people who aren't involved in agriculture either aren't going to support it, or they don't care, or it's kind of just not at the forefront of their mind. But I've kind of been, I've had that idea flipped on its head just by talking to people from more urban areas, and been kind of surprised by just how curious they are about lifestyles that they're not involved in, whether it be agricultural or just general rural areas, or kind of even like foreign areas that have to do with ways of life that they don't have access to.
I mean, I've always been, not always. I can't say always, honestly, but ever since I've thought about it, I've been curious about peppers and
Hmm.
how does this pepper grow? Where why is this corn different from that corn? Like, I know it's different.
Right.
Why is it different? Things like
Right.
that. I mean, I mean, but then again, I'm a curious person. I don't think it's that urban people don't care. I think it's that people are too worried about, keeping a roof over their head or
Hmm.
whatever.
Yeah, no, definitely. And I've kind of learned through through interactions with people and through experience that it's not just that they don't care necessarily. It's more that they don't have access to the information readily available. And you can make arguments that the internet is free and that they have access to that. But most people, like you mentioned, they have bigger fish to fry. They have other issues that are worth worrying about, and they're not going to take
Well,
their time to actively do research on agriculture. They're just kind of trust what they're told.
it's like, I mean, it's like I did a podcast series, a deep dive series on the Spanish flu and COVID-19,
Hmm.
and I have a master's degree in history. Um, but I've learned a lot more about viruses in the last year than I ever knew before.
Hmm.
But it's because I researched it online. I googled it, but I also had the education to sift through, the 5G,
Right.
the things like that.
Hmm.
Um, and I don't know if the lab leak hypothesis is for real, but I know it's out there.
Hmm.
I don't know if I believe it, but I've certainly read compelling evidence from people who seem to think it could be real or real adjacent.
Right.
But
Yeah. No, definitely. I
I
mean,
mean, but it gets back to, you have to. There's an amazing machine in front of me, but you have to know how to type in what you
right.
want to what you want to hear or what you want to read or whatever.
Hmm. Yeah, and there's a big part of it that has to do with the wording that you even type in. If I look up something, you know, depending on how I word a question, I'm going to get very different results on my answer, kind of thing. If
Or
you
clean out your cache, or when you clean out your
right,
history.
right,
You know.
yeah. No, yeah, exactly. I mean, like anything you looked up in the past, as you look up new things, that's going to alter the information that's available to you. If you're looking up primarily things that lean towards a very specific type of mindset, and you're trying to get answers on a different type of mindset, you're going to have a hard time unless you're really careful about what you're looking for.
Yeah. Yeah. For true. Um.
Awesome.
Yeah. So I can hear in your voice. You say you're from California, but
I am.
I hear in your voice a touch of the South.
Yeah, so I actually grew up in Central California, so not quite south, but basically we are kind of the most southern type area of California. Very very rural, very agriculturally based. I grew up working with cows and going to rodeos and all that sort of stuff. So definitely not the typical Californian.
Did your But I heard how you said awesome, and that's how somebody from the South would say awesome.
Yeah,
you
no,
know.
I
Oh.
get that a lot from my dad.
Yeah.
He grew up here in California as well, but his family's all Okies, so we have a very
Ah.
I guess kind of Oklahoma style verbiage to our to kind of some of the things we
Okay.
say.
All right. Okay. Okay. Yeah. 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 Yeah.
Yeah,
So
but
do you have any other questions, or because I have
I
questions
mean,
for you?
okay. I think that kind of answered everything I was looking for from the history side of things. But yeah, if you have anything, I'm kind of curious to hear what you think.
As far as the urban rural divide, or as far as
Whatever
I
you got.
think,
I mean, if you have any
yeah,
questions or anything.
I think our current setup is unsustainable. I honestly do. I think
Hmm.
it's totally unsustainable. Um, a $3,000 two-bed or one-bedroom apartment is just not a sustainable way to live.
Hmm.
And then when you talk to this lawyer and you find out why that apartment is $3,000, and you're like, oh, okay, we need to change that.
Hmm.
Like, like
Yeah.
I don't know if you're aware, but we in the 2010s or 2010, they decoupled
Hmm.
rent from the market, from the law of supply and demand. right? So at the federal
Huh.
level, so we need to change that. We
Hmm.
need to move. We need to move that back. Um,
Yes.
but so I got a question. How do you? Okay, so when you do your let me see, you have your basic beef that I can get at Kroger, but what percentage of your produce is actually going to the I guess the more boutique marketplaces, like the more boutique grocery stores and things like that?
So is that kind of so is your question kind of based off of the percentage of produce grown in the United States? And what percentage of that is going to kind of higher end grocery stores, or I'm kind of confused by your question.
Well, in your community, in your town, or
Okay.
yeah, like what? First of all, what do y'all grow, uh, per se?
So in my neck of the woods, we are mostly dairy oriented. So we have a lot of dairy farms. Trees have started to take over quite a bit. So we grow almonds, pistachios, some row crops like cotton and corn and that sort of thing. Lots of silage corn. So we have a big sector of our farmland dedicated to growing feed for animals. Um, that's most of it. In kind of like the surrounding areas, citrus is pretty popular. You know, if you start to kind of go south, you'll start seeing more. Um, what's the word I'm looking for? Kind of like more colder climate style crops, kind of like strawberries might be more common kind of on the coastal areas. Beef cattle are kind of more common up in the hills. You'll see a lot of those. Pork and chickens are kind of more common up north, that sort of thing. But in if we're talking specifically about my hometown or my home county, yeah, it's mostly dairy, pistachios, almonds, and then a few row crops here and there.
Okay, cool.
Yeah,
I
and
wasn't aware of I was aware that there's a county that grows somewhere in California. There's a county that grows most of the was it olives or like every it's literally like every olive in America comes out of one county in California, just about it.
that sounds about right. I for off the top of my head, I couldn't tell you which one it was, but I know that
Yeah.
California. I mean, California is probably most popular for their grapes because of Napa Valley. But
Mm,
yeah, California is actually one of, if not the most agriculturally productive state in the entire country.
yeah. I went to California years ago at this point, and it was shocking. I mean, every notion of California I'd had before that was like from music videos or from movies or whatever, right? So
Right.
but what was amazing was how rural it actually was.
Hmm.
Like, and I mean like really, really rural, and also
Yeah.
like productive. Like a lot of I remember there was the biggest field of strawberries I'd ever seen in my life. Just huge.
Oh yeah, yeah, and that's a big thing that people tend to not realize. Like, I can't tell you how many times I've gone out of state and people find out that I'm not only from California, but I'm involved in agriculture and I come from kind of a, like kind of like you. They hear my accent and they're very confused by it. Um,
Yeah.
and I have to explain to them like, hey, California is more than just LA and San Francisco, and we're not just a whole beach. Like, you'd be surprised how many people think that the entire state of California is a beach. And so I had to explain to them like, no, actually, most of California is very rural, very agriculturally based. It's almost like New York. New York's kind of like that. We have New York City and Albany and some of the other larger cities, but most of New York, in terms of in terms of acreage, is agricultural land.
Well, I think that's a problem. I mean, I think that's a like when I was talking to people for my podcast, people first of all, they would always tell me you don't sound southern, and secondly, they would say, "Atlanta, isn't that a small town?" Like, and I'd be like, "No, it's huge. It's like I think we've got like 7.5, 8 million people there, whatever it
Yeah.
is. Like we gained like 1 million people this last census.
Wow.
It's just huge. I
Yeah.
mean,
No, it's definitely massive.
I mean, you know, um, but that's a problem that we don't understand. Like the rural people and the urban people. It's not north and south. I think it's urban rural. We
Right.
just don't understand each other, and I think we need to. If we want to still be a country, we need to start trying to do that more.
Right. No,
That's really what I'm saying.
Yeah,
You
I agree
know,
with you 100%. That's actually kind of one of the big driving points of this. Like, I'm kind of doing a mini series right now of, kind of explaining this, the urban rural divide and kind of why it needs to be mended, not just because I think people need to get involved in agriculture or anything like that, but I think that having an active communication about this stuff, I think that having an understanding of both sides of the coin is, vital in order to make the country run more efficiently and kind of stay stable.
Thank you all so much for listening. I hope you enjoyed the episode, and big shout out to Ben for sticking around and for doing the episode with me. It was sure a lot of fun. I'll be plugging all of his stuff down in the description, so be sure to go check that out. And I hope to see you all next week. And don't forget, if you ate today, thank a farmer.